Hi, welcome to How Encryption Works, a webinar by LMG Security. My name is Natalie Adams and I'm your moderator for today. Before we start the program, I would like to give you some housekeeping information. First, we encourage attendees to use the computer audio feature of this webinar. During the program, should you experience any audio interference, such as static or intermittent audio due to a busy network, please use the optional phone connection, which is listed in the audio tab of the webinar interface. Second, we will have a question and answer session at the end of the program. You may submit questions anytime by using the QA tab in the webinar interface, or you can save them until the end. Next, the video of the webinar will be made available after the event. All attendees will receive a notification once the video is live, which also include links to any supplemental files. Please feel free to download these helpful files for your reference later on. Last but certainly not least, a survey will be available to you at the conclusion of this webinar. Please take the opportunity to provide feedback on your webinar experience. Our presenter for the webinar today is Sherry Davidoff. Sherry Davidoff is the CEO of LMG Security. As a recognized expert in cybersecurity and data breach response, Sherry has been called a, quote, security badass by the New York Times. Her new book, Data Breaches, Crisis and Opportunity, is available now. Her professional experiences are featured in the book, Breaking and Entering, the extraordinary story of a hacker called Alien. Sherry is a GIAC certified forensic examiner and penetration tester, receiving her degree in computer science and electrical engineering from MIT. Her new book, Ransomware Response, will be published early next year, so keep your eyes out for that. Sherry, at this time, I'm passing you control of the webinar.
Thank you so much, Natalie, and welcome to today's webinar. I have bamboozled you a little bit. We're actually going to be talking about more than just encryption. In fact, we'll be talking about cryptographic technology in general. Beyond just encrypting data to keep it confidential, there are also ways that cryptography is used to authenticate people and to help in other ways. Without cryptography, we wouldn't have VPNs. We wouldn't have SSL and TLS that keeps websites secure. We wouldn't have encrypted end-to-end phone calls to keep our phone calls private. Also, cryptography is critical for Bitcoin, for making the dark web work and keeping things anonymous, and of course for ransomware. We are going to touch on all of those topics today and more. So we're going to start off by talking about why do we need cryptography and what do we use it for? Then we'll dig into how encryption works. I'm going to start off by telling you about symmetric key encryption, and then we'll talk about encryption at rest versus encryption at transit. In order to understand how encryption in transit works, we need to learn about asymmetric key public key cryptography. So don't be scared, it's going to come out simpler than it sounds. Then we'll talk about digital signatures, how they work and what we can do with them. There's a lot of ways in which we have not realized the full potential of this technology, and so I'm excited to spread the word about some of it so that we can all work to adopt it and move the ball forward. We'll also touch on how Bitcoin works, because why not? We're already learning everything else you would need to know to understand it. And then we'll talk about how web security works. So the technologies that we're using right now that you're using to watch me and that your web browser is employing behind the scenes are actually fundamentally used in lots of other ways as well. So we'll touch on that. And then finally, we'll conclude by talking about end-to-end encryption and give you some takeaways. And along the way, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in. We'll have time for questions at the end. So what do we need encryption for? Well, first of all, to keep things confidential. That's probably the number one thing people think of when they think of cryptography. How do we keep messages secret? We can use encryption to lock up information on computers and phones. So if you lose a laptop, you don't have to worry so much about somebody getting your data, and you might not have to report it as a breach. We can hide passwords and credit card numbers as they're in transit across the internet, so that if you're sitting at a wireless coffee shop, you don't have to worry about somebody sniffing your traffic and stealing that very sensitive information. We can use it to protect databases from hackers, so that even if a hacker breaks into a server, they may still not be able to get all the sensitive information in databases. And finally, we can use it to keep conversations private. It's been very interesting to see this emergence of end-to-end encrypted phone and video conversations, and so we'll talk about how they work and what we're likely to see in the future. Also, of course, encryption can be used for evil, as is the case with ransomware. So these are very powerful technologies that can be used for good or ill, like any powerful technology. We can also use cryptography for identification. How can we tell if it really was the CEO who sent that email or if it was a scammer? There are ways that we could be employing cryptography that we're not using it today, and it has the potential to solve some very big problems. Can I trust this website? We do employ cryptography to solve this particular issue. Authorization. We can authorize an application to read your email or on your behalf, or to do other activities on your behalf as well by giving it a token. And you can use lots of services, but maybe you only need to log in once. We use cryptography to help make that happen. Finally, we can use cryptography to help verify message integrity so that anyone can verify that when a message was sent, it wasn't altered after the fact. Now, if we can do that, we can make sure that a message hasn't been altered, and we can verify who wrote that message. That opens up a whole world of possibilities, and that's what digital signatures are all about. Once we have the capability to authenticate and verify message integrity, then we can do things like send money, and that's the basis of cryptocurrency. So with that, let's get to the meat of this. What is encryption? Just to make sure we're all on the same page. Encryption is the process of scrambling a message so that it can only be read by authorized people. So if you have person A, we'll call him Sam, says this is a secret and wants to send that to Alice, he can encrypt that information, broadcast it to the world, and nobody can read it except Alice, because she has a secret key. So, which brings us to, how does encryption work? Well, we start with data, of course, and we change the data. We need two things to change the data. Number one, an algorithm, and number two, a key. So an algorithm and a key. And only the people that have the key can unscramble the data. Okay, so that brings us to the question, what is an algorithm? This is a very fancy word that we hear all the time. We know encryption algorithms need to be strong, but what exactly is that? Well, an algorithm is actually a really simple concept. It's just a logical step-by-step procedure that you or maybe your computer can follow. So here's an example. This is an algorithm. I'm going to take a number. I'm going to add 12. I'm going to multiply by 349 and divide by 6 and take the remainder. That, in this case, is my algorithm, whatever step-by-step procedure you come up with. And some procedures are more effective for encrypting or encoding than others. And that's, we'll get into strong and weak algorithms later, but keep that in mind. All right, so then the other question is, what is a key? We hear about encryption keys all the time. Your computer certainly doesn't have a box full of little metal keys. A key is just a long, hopefully random string of digits. In fact, the longer and more random, the better, because your key is used as part of the algorithm. So if we want to lock up a message, we might take an algorithm like this, but include a secret number, that key. So I'm going to add 12 plus n, where n is my key. And the key is going to be some super long, crazy string of random digits, and that means anybody who can see this out there in the world can't read it unless they know what that secret key is, right? So that key is just a really long string, and it's usually stored in a file on your computer or maybe on a USB device, something like that. But again, when you think of a key, just remember that's all it is. And you want it to be long and random so that nobody can guess your key, because if someone can guess the key, then they could potentially break your encryption. So what can we encrypt? Well, pretty much anything, at least anything on your computer. It's all just numbers, right? So text, of course, can be translated to numbers. You can see the ASCII chart translating letters to binary right there on the screen. Pictures are just numbers under the hood. Audio, video, all of this is just numbers. So that means that really we can perform those procedures. We can run that algorithm on anything and encrypt it. There's two kinds of encryption I want to talk about today: symmetric key encryption and asymmetric key encryption. And again, even though these sound like big words, it's actually a pretty simple concept. Symmetric key encryption just means that the same key that locks up a message can also be used to unlock it. So all you need is one key, and it will lock it and then unlock it. So you take your secret and you run the encryption algorithm using the key as input, and it produces this gobbledygook that nobody can read. And then if you want to read it, you use that same key with the decryption algorithm, and boom, you can read that secret again. Symmetric key encryption. So how can you tell if encryption is strong? Well, we've touched on this. The longer and more random that key is, the better, because if someone can guess it, they can reverse that encryption. And then some algorithms are just better at encrypting things than others. In some cases, it's possible for mathematicians to find patterns in the output, or other ways to reverse engineer what the key might be. So you can look up whatever encryption algorithm is used. Honestly, Google's a really good place to start. Right now, a very common algorithm that's used and considered strong is AES. Again, that's just a method that's used, a procedure used to encrypt data. And if you see AES 256, 256 refers to the number of bits used in the key. So 256 bits, that's a pretty long key. And again, the longer the better. But there's a trade-off, because the longer your key, the more work you're doing, and the longer it might take to do that encryption. So you have to balance that. If you look, some outdated algorithms include DES. That's one that shouldn't really be used anymore. We do occasionally see algorithms like that in use. If you want to verify that an encryption algorithm is strong, of course, you can talk to a security consultant or a cryptographer, and they can help provide you with some more advanced feedback. The bottom line, though, is that encryption is strong if the keys are stored securely. I've seen lots of cases where companies tout the strength of their encryption algorithm, but then they never talk about how they're storing the keys. In fact, most of the time they don't talk about how they store the keys, who has access to the keys, have the keys ever been stolen. These are the really big questions that we need to be asking, because typically when criminals break encryption, they're not really breaking it these days, they're bypassing it, or they're stealing the keys. One example of symmetric key encryption is the Enigma machine, which you can see in the picture right here. So Enigma was used in World War II by the Nazis to encode their communications, and they would then broadcast their communications out to the world by radio. These included things like U-boat positions, military information, all of their plans. All of it was encrypted, though. So it was almost accessible to the Allies, but they couldn't figure out how to crack the code. Now, the way the Enigma machine worked was that the sender and the receiver both had an Enigma machine, and they both had to be in exactly the same configuration. So to give you an example, you'll notice these 3 rotors on top of the Enigma machine. So each of those has 26 settings, and those help to determine a key that's used in the encryption process. These rotors had to be in exactly the same position because, again, this is a symmetric algorithm. And the Nazis could change those at any point. So even if someone even if someone figured out the key, they would have to, once it was changed, they would have to go through that process all over again. There were also 10 position plug boards for pairing letters. So overall, the Enigma machine had over 159 quintillion possible settings. Pretty daunting. Well, all of this made it impossible for the Allies to crack the code until Alan Turing came along in 1943. And Alan Turing built a machine that enabled the Allies to crack the code. In part because the Nazis were using some regular phrases repeatedly in their statements. So he was able to map those and then reverse engineer what the key was at any point so that they could encrypt communications going forward. These days, symmetric key encryption is commonly used for encryption at rest. And when we talk about encryption at rest, we're talking about situations like these, where your data is sitting in the grass on a sunny day. No, but seriously, where your data is sitting at rest on a USB drive, or on a laptop, or in a data center, and it's not traveling across the internet. So when it's sitting on a hard drive or something like that, how do we keep it secure? The reason we use symmetric key encryption is because it's fast. It's actually faster than asymmetric key encryption. So you'll see it used when you're talking about large volumes of data. Now, when we encrypt the data, let's say on a laptop, you have to have, your computer uses the key to do that. So you might be thinking to yourself, okay, but isn't there a problem here? Like, doesn't that key need to live on the laptop? So what if a criminal picks up that laptop? Can't they just get the key and decrypt everything? Well, back in the day, that used to be the case, but of course, pretty quickly, cryptographers and people building computers figured out ways to hide that key. So there's a couple different ways. One is sometimes it's password-based. So when you log into a computer that has full disk encryption, one way to do this is for your password to be used to encrypt the symmetric key. So there's actually another encrypted file that contains the symmetric key, and your password is actually the key to decrypt that. Another way we see that this done is through Tpm chips, a little hardware chip on your computer. And that chip has a key hard-coded into it, but nobody can read the key. Nobody can get the key out of the chip. The chip is not designed ever to transmit that information. Instead, it will perform functions using the key. So maybe it can encrypt data using the key. And often we see it used to encrypt a key bag, a file, essentially, it's not a bag, a file that is a group of other symmetric keys that is then in turn used to encrypt other things. So anyway, we don't need to get too into the weeds, but that's how full disk encryption is commonly done. Either your password is used to encrypt that secret key, or your a TPM chip on your computer is used to encrypt secret keys. There's a difference between full disk encryption, which is unlocked during the boot process, and then file system encryption. And with file system encryption, your computer boots up, the operating system loads, and then all of your files have been encrypted, so the file system gets decrypted at that point. I got asked before this talk for some product recommendations. BitLocker is very commonly used and considered to be a strong program. FileVault is installed natively on Mac systems. And then VeraCrypt is a very popular open source tool that you can use to encrypt things as well. So those are 3 recommendations that may come in handy for you. All right, so you might be asking, what about encrypted documents? What if I want to encrypt a file? Well, you can use any of the programs that I just mentioned, or at least VeraCrypt and BitLocker. I'm not sure that FileVault encrypts files, individual files. But also you can use tools that are built in natively to Microsoft Word and Adobe products and similar products like that. And the strength of the encryption process will vary depending on the program that you use. So it's actually easier to break the encryption on most Microsoft encrypted products than it is Adobe products, because Adobe just has a more complex process for encrypting PDFs. So when you encrypt a document, the program will encrypt the contents of that document, and they will encrypt the key as well using a password that you set. That's important because otherwise you wouldn't be able to send the document to someone else and have them decrypt it, right? So the document's encrypted, the key is encrypted and added to that document that is sent out to another person who then goes through the decryption process using the password. This whole thing relies on the strength of that password, right? If you pick a weak password, or if you choose a password that's been reused or is easily guessable, anybody can break the encryption on those documents. Also, remember, you have this file that is just sitting at rest on a computer. And computers are pretty fast these days. So that means that we can go through a process and try to guess that password repeatedly over and over. That's essentially how it works when you're talking about cracking encryption. It's guessing or calculating over and over potential passwords for that file. A common desktop computer can make billions of attempts, at least hundreds of thousands of millions, and then the more powerful ones can actually try billions of passwords per second. At LMG, we have a Kraken, which is a souped up computer designed to crack passwords. For example, we've actually had this happen a couple times where an IT administrator leaves an organization and they leave behind an encrypted spreadsheet. So we've been asked to recover the key to unlock the spreadsheet. So we threw it on the Kraken, and in the most recent case, it took certainly less than a couple of hours to recover the password for that Excel spreadsheet, because our computer was capable of trying about 10 billion passwords per second. So pretty quick. So keep that in mind as you're setting a password for these files. Remember, it really does need to be quite strong. Longer passwords are stronger because it just takes more time for a computer to get up to the point where they could, if you set like a 20 or 25 character password, that takes a really, really long time for a computer to get to that point, and it may just not be feasible depending on the type of encryption used. All right, so that was encryption at rest. Let's talk about encryption as your data goes through the internet. On the internet, your data goes through lots of other computers. So it might seem that when I send you an email, it just goes straight from my computer all the way to yours. But the reality is it's just like a postcard going through the mail, right? It stops at lots of different waypoints. There's lots of different stations. And there's all kinds of reasons why someone might want to view your traffic as it goes across the internet, for marketing purposes, for monitoring purposes, all kinds of reasons. When you send an email across the internet, think of it as a postcard if it's not encrypted. Anybody can read the information on it. And I have seen so many times over the past 20 years, people who put a little note at the bottom of an email that says, the contents of this email and any attachments are confidential. And unfortunately, when the email is unencrypted, that's a bit misleading, right? Because it's not. It's like writing that on a postcard. So make sure that your email is encrypted as it goes across the internet. And when I say that, there are different ways to encrypt information in transit, some of which are much more effective than others. So we'll get to that. What kinds of information do we need to encrypt in transit? Well, things like login information, passwords, credit card information as you shop online, emails as they go across the internet. Those are a few of the most common things that we want to encrypt. And we do this using, well, in part, asymmetric key encryption. This is also known as public key encryption. So if I want to send you a message, I can do that using asymmetric key encryption. What that means is that we have two keys. They're actually a pair, and they're created as a pair. What one key locks, the other key unlocks. And that is the crux of asymmetric key encryption. It's actually what makes a ton of security tools work. So just remember, asymmetric key encryption, also the same thing as public key encryption. What one key locks, the other key unlocks. And you can see that illustrated on the screen here. So we'll go through some examples. I have a friend named Sam. Sam in real life has a business and it's in West Philadelphia, and he will get some pretty expensive shipments. Now, what happens if you get an expensive shipment delivered to a porch in West Philadelphia? It gets stolen pretty quickly. And Sam got tired of that, and so he got this big wooden trunk and he screwed it down to his front porch. And there is a padlock on that trunk. Anybody can put things in the box because the padlock is open. That's the same as giving everyone a key, giving the public a key. Anybody in the public can open up that lock and put things in the box for Sam and lock it again, right? But who can open that box? Hint, only Sam. Because only Sam's secret key can be used to unlock that box. And that's essentially the way public-private key encryption works. What one key locks, the other key unlocks. So your public can lock up messages to you, and only you with the private key, the secret key, can unlock that message. And that's why if you want to send somebody a message, you need their public key, and only they can lock it with their secret key. So let's say Alice wants to send Sam a secret message. This is a secret. Alice needs Sam's public key and uses that in the encryption algorithm to produce this scrambled message. So what does Sam need to unlock this? Sam needs his private key and the decryption algorithm, and that's it. And then Sam can read the secret message. Without that private key, people can't read the secret message. Public-private key encryption, also known as asymmetric key encryption. Unfortunately, asymmetric key encryption is also used by criminals to lock up our computers and hold us hostage. In fact, most modern strains of ransomware use actually a hybrid approach now. And the reason is, remember that symmetric key encryption is really fast, super fast. So when you get infected with ransomware, the criminals are going to generate a symmetric key, not all the time, but with our most modern and advanced strains of ransomware like Sedinakey or Maze, they're going to generate a private key specific to your computer that they are locking up. And then they will very quickly go through and encrypt all the files that they can, because symmetric key encryption is very fast. But they know better than to leave that symmetric key on your computer out in the open, because they know that people will find a way to unlock the files. That's where asymmetric key encryption comes in, and it is absolutely critical for ransomware gangs. So the criminals will also generate a public-private key pair To use Sedinikibi as an example, there's a public-private key pair generated for every computer that's infected. So the private key is used to lock up that symmetric key that was used to encrypt everything else, so you can't get access to the key. And then the public key is included in your ransom note. So if you look at a Sedinikibi ransom note, also known as REvil, by the way, you will see you have to give them the public key. And then if you pay the ransom, they will presumably give you the private key to unlock your files. Now, REvil, by the way, is the #1 most commonly found ransomware strain out there today. So this is something that comes up all the time. And the one really important thing to know about ransomware is you need to collect every REvil ransomware note and give them each individual key. There's a different key for every computer you want to unlock. If you just give them one key, and you pay for that one key, you're going to find it only decrypts one computer. And you will then have to go back to them for every single other computer that you want to unlock. So really you want to negotiate in bulk, collect all those ransom notes, make sure you know which key goes to which computer, right? Super important. I've seen cases where the ransom notes were collected and nobody was tracking which computer was which. And so then you give yourself a headache when you try to go and decrypt things. So again, make sure that you're keeping track of, make sure that you collect all of those notes and you're keeping track of which public key goes with which computer. Also, we've seen variants like Dharma. Dharma, in some cases, will encrypt file shares individually and then issue different keys for different shares. So you have to pay to buy back the HR share, and the key for the HR share will not unlock the key to your finance share. So kind of an interesting twist. All of this is done using asymmetric key encryption. A new development that we've seen in the past year is that some of these ransomware gangs are encrypting your key with other public keys as well, so that they can give access to affiliate groups. So this is actually fueling the movement towards the franchise model as well. Encryption, very powerful in good ways and bad. All right, so now that we understand how asymmetric key encryption works, let's talk about digital signatures. In digital signing, we are using asymmetric key encryption, and that means we have a pair of keys. And what one key what one key signs, the other key can verify. So pair of keys, what one key signs, anyone else can verify. So you might sign a document like a contract using your private key, cryptographically sign it, and then anyone can use your public key that can be published out there in the world. You can put it on your website, you can put it in your email signature, whatever you want. They can use that key to verify that, yep, it was you that signed it, and it hasn't been modified. So this is the same as, we can make a real life analogy here. So let's go back to Sam's box. If we come up to the box, let's say last time we looked at it, it was closed, and now we see it's open. Well, somebody took an action. Who could have taken that action? Well, if that key is actually secret, there's only one person who could have unlocked the box, and that is Sam. So that's how digital signatures work. Again, we know if we see that signature, there's only one person who could have made that signature, the person with the secret key, and we can verify that using the other key, the public key. All right, so let's walk through another example. Alice wants to prove that she sent a message. One example might be if Alice says, hey, I want you to purchase 300 shares of this stock. And Sam wants to verify that it actually was her and that message wasn't modified in transit. So Alice is going to use her private key and the message, and she's going to create a digital signature, which she appends to that message. Remember, digital signing does not keep your information confidential. It is there to verify the identity of the person that sent it, so authenticate the sender, and it's used to confirm message integrity. Because if even one letter of that message is changed, then the digital signature is not going to check out. The message itself is used as input in this process. So she combines the message with the private key. She does some math using the algorithm, the same algorithm every time, and we come up with a signature. Yep, we're going to purchase 300 shares. Now, Sam wants to verify that this actually was her and the message wasn't modified, so he takes Alice's public key. He's going to combine that with the signature and the message in this verification algorithm. And voila, he checks and sees, yep, that signature is correct. Alice did say to purchase 300 shares. So that's at a high level how digital signing works. I also want to briefly touch on cryptographic checksums, also known as hashes. And this is, I promise, the last mathematical concept that I will introduce today. But a hash is just an algorithm, or it's the result of an algorithm that's applied to a piece of data. So I might have anything from a hard drive to an email message to a contract. I will create, I'll run that hashing algorithm, and it results in this teeny tiny little checksum. For example, you can see one on the screen there, C2850EA, etc. Now that is a one-way hash. That means that once I run this algorithm, it will produce this very short output, but I can't figure out the original message just by looking at that hash, right? There's just not enough information there. The value of this is that I can verify that some piece of data wasn't changed. And to give you an example, look at the bottom of the screen here. You can see these two different phrases. Go Packers results in one hash. This is an MD5 hash. If I change that uppercase P to a lowercase p, the output will be completely different. So that is the power of hashing. You have a tiny short piece of data that can tell you if the message has been changed at any point, or if the original message was different than the message now. Like if I keep that original hash on file and I check it later and then they're different, I know something's been changed. So that is the concept of hashing and digital signing. What are the benefits of digital signing? Well, as we talked about, we can use it for authentication to verify the identity of a sender. We can use it for message integrity to verify that a message was not changed. And we can also use it for non-repudiation. So Alice can't come back later and say, Sam, I never told you to buy 300 shares. We have that cryptographically signed by you, Alice, and we know that it was signed using your private key. So authentication, integrity, and non-repudiation. Recently, we've seen a big trend where attackers are working hard to steal private keys. We've seen this in a number of cases. So for example, if you saw the announcement of the Mimecast breach a few weeks ago, this was on the heels of SolarWinds and presumably related to that. Attackers stole a private certificate that was used to encrypt communications between Office 365 servers and Mimecast clients. Mimecast is an email security service. And that meant any attacker with that private key could read those email communications. Attackers also want to be able to digitally sign software. If you look at SolarWinds, remember the attackers wormed their way into SolarWinds and were able to modify the code, and then that code, the new SolarWinds product, shipped out. Now it had a correct digital signature from the manufacturer, which normally means that, hey, this software is genuine, nobody put malware in it. So they were able to insert that code before it was cryptographically signed. And you can see a picture of the SolarWinds digital signature on the screen there. So the customers could check, and in many cases did automatically check those updates, and they saw a genuine signature from SolarWinds. You can also see that criminals recently have been really working to steal private keys in order to gain access to resources. So last month in our Top Threats webinar, we talked about how they're stealing private certificates to forge SAML tokens, which allows them to impersonate anybody on the network. I believe that was in the Malwarebytes breach. So again, private keys are very valuable for attackers, and they can use private keys to steal your money, as is the case in Bitcoin. So we'll talk about that more in just a few minutes. As we've mentioned, you may be seeing a trend. Your key security is critically important. Really, the security of your encryption these days rests largely on the security of the keys. So a lot of times people store keys on your computer, and that is fine. There's a trade-off. If your computer gets infected, the criminals may steal your keys. Another way that you can store keys very securely is using a USB device or something like a YubiKey. So YubiKey is one example of a device that's designed to facilitate authentication, cryptographic authentication. You can store keys using it. You can generate keys using it. It's very, very sophisticated. So I just wanted to mention it because they're easy to use. They're widely supported. You can use them out of the box with Google, Facebook, GitHub, Docker, Dropbox, Salesforce, all kinds of other stuff. So take a look at that if you are interested. There are some trade-offs when it comes to key security. It is important to keep your key secure. You don't want hackers to get it. But you need to be able to get access to it as well. And if you lose access to your private key, you may lose access to your data. In one case recently, a German programmer lost access to the private keys that controlled his Bitcoin. and he found himself on the precipice of losing $220 million worth of Bitcoin. This was last month. So he had been storing his Bitcoin wallet on a thumb drive, an iron key. And those thumb drives are designed to self-destruct if someone attempts to guess passwords too many times. And he had forgotten the password to his iron key. So he was down to 2 last attempts when the news picked up on this, and there was this huge hubbub about it in the news. It turned out that he did not remember the keys. The iron drive did self-destruct, and he lost $220 million. I looked up just last week to see where he was at that, and there was an article that said he had made peace with his loss. But that's still a pretty good example of the downsides of keeping your keys maybe too secure. Really, you can back up your private keys pretty easily. I know a lot of people who actually print them out and keep them in a safe. And if you ever need them, that would be a giant pain in the neck to retype your 256-bit keys. But hey, if you have $220 million on the line, I bet you could figure it out. All right, so that gets us to Bitcoin. We're talking about private keys, we're talking about Bitcoin. How do these relate to each other? Well, what is a Bitcoin? A Bitcoin is just a chain of digital signatures. Literally, that's all it is, a chain of digital signatures. That's according to its creator, Satoshi Nakamoto, or synonymously, Satoshi Nakamoto. So we already have the foundation to understand how Bitcoin works. So I'm going to step you through it. First of all, what is cryptocurrency? The whole point of cryptocurrency is that you don't have to send coins around the world. It used to be the case that people would send literally cash in the mail in some cases. You don't need to do that anymore. So in cryptocurrency, we don't send coins, we track transactions and we keep them in a ledger. And that's what the blockchain is. The blockchain is just a ledger, a record of transactions that is distributed around the world. Anybody can keep a copy of this. And here's a simplified model of what the blockchain actually looks like. So in blockchain, you have a block of data that represents an initial amount of cryptocurrency, and then there's a chain of transactions associated with that, literally attached to that block. And then that block is cryptographically linked to the next one, and on and on and on. And if that sounds complicated, let's see what it actually looks like on your computer. When I say that the ledger is distributed, this is what it looks like. It's literally just a folder full of files. This is the Bitcoin blockchain listed out, and you can see all the individual blocks, and that grows over time. And you can keep a copy of it on your computer. There's probably tens of thousands of copies out there in the world today, just circulating. When we talk about your Bitcoin wallet, a Bitcoin wallet does not keep money. It doesn't keep coins. Instead, your Bitcoin wallet keeps keys. That's weird. In real life, we don't have a wallet that keeps keys. I have a key ring that keeps keys. But when it comes to cryptocurrency, your wallet holds your private key. Remember, your private key is used to sign a transaction. So that's how you control your money, is with that private key. A lot of people ask, how are Bitcoins made? Well, a Bitcoin is, you are issued Bitcoins when you solve a very complicated math problem. And that's how you create a new block in the blockchain. So there's a really hard math problem, and you have to use a lot of computing power to solve it. You might have to work for weeks or months to solve it. It actually gets harder and harder over time, so there will be fewer and fewer Bitcoins minted. If you got into Bitcoin in the early days, it was actually really easy to mine Bitcoins at that time. In fact, I was actually on the original mailing list that received the paper that invented Bitcoin. It was Halloween in 2008, and I remember thinking, oh, that's pretty cool. A digital currency. Well, I'm going to go to a Halloween party. And sometime after that, a bunch of my friends were like, we're going to go mine some Bitcoin. And I was like, I'm going to go to the movies. And now I'm like, darn it. But anyway, the whole point is you have this really hard math problem, and you have to prove that you worked at it by showing the solution. When you find the answer to one of these really hard math problems, it starts a new block, and you present that to the blockchain. You cryptographically sign your answer. Anybody can verify that the answer is correct. It's actually fairly easy to verify the answer as opposed to finding it in the first place. And then they can verify that it is you that has the Bitcoin using your public key if they choose. So it gets signed and it gets added to the network. So again, that's how you create a new block. And then once you have your Bitcoin, you may want to spend it. And you do that by creating a transaction and signing it with your private key. So that's how Bitcoin works. Let's walk through an example of this. Let's say Alice wants to pay the plumber in Bitcoin. The plumber is really excited about this, apparently. So Alice will create a message that says, I am going to pay the plumber $500. And this looks complicated, but it's not that complicated. Alice takes her private key in red and uses that to sign a copy of the message, and also she also uses as input the previous transaction and the plumber's public key. So we take the plumber's public key, we use the previous transaction, and then we attach that to a message that says, I'm going to pay this plumber $500. And she cryptographically signs that whole thing. The reason why all this information is important is because we need to know what Alice is sending. And remember, a Bitcoin is really a chain of digital signatures, so she needs to link it to the previous transaction. So she's she's including the previous transaction. She's saying, I'm going to pay $500 to this person, and we're including information that's derived from the plumber's public key so that anyone can verify where this money is going. So that creates our new transaction message. The new transaction message is sent out to the Bitcoin blockchain, and then the plumber and anyone else can verify that the money was actually sent. So that's an example of Alice paying the plumber $500 in Bitcoin. So how do we keep our money safe? Well, criminals are working hard to steal cryptocurrency. Last year, $1.9 billion in cryptocurrency was stolen. And again, attackers are doing that by targeting private keys. This is a trend in 2021. Expect to see more and more hackers creating tools and targeting private keys because they're useful for all kinds of things, especially now that Bitcoin is worth so much money. So you want to make sure that you store your private keys securely. If your wallet is in the cloud, make sure that you use two-factor authentication. Super important. And you might consider storing your private keys or your wallet on a USB, but don't lose that USB. Make sure you're backing up that information, unlike our poor friend who was the German programmer. All right, so now we have covered so much. You guys are doing great. We've talked about symmetric key encryption, asymmetric key encryption, digital signing. Let's talk about how we surf the web securely. The reason I waited until this point to discuss it is because we are going to use pretty much all of the technologies that we've talked about up to this point in order to understand exactly what your web browser is doing when you see that little lock icon. So when you see HTTPS, that's typically representing the SSL/TLS protocol in use. The lock icon means that we have verified that this website is authentic and that the messages between us and the server are encrypted. So we want to do this because we want to make sure that it's not actually a phishing website, that the website we're going to really is what they say they are. And we want to keep our communications safe from prying eyes. To do this, we use both symmetric and asymmetric key encryption. So let's take an example. Let's say I want to go to my bank's website, and I'm concerned that a hacker might be intercepting my traffic because people want your bank account password. This has been a big issue over the past 15, 20 years. Or what if I click on a link in a phishing email, I think it's my bank, or I think it's PayPal, or I think it's Amazon, and they're actually just trying to steal my password. It goes to a website that looks like those, but really isn't. How can I tell? Again, look at that lock icon. Check it. When you click that lock icon, you will see typically a digital certificate. And you can see it on the screen there. The web server presents you with a certificate, and the certificate has all the identifying information of that website. So read it, take a look. In this case, the certificate says the website owner is Wells Fargo and Company. How do I know that it's really Wells Fargo though? Well, I know it because a third party has checked for me. In this case, the third party is DigiCert. Again, take a look at that certificate and you can see. There are companies like DigiCert and VeriSign. Their job is to be the certificate authority, to check the information of these certificates, talk to the owner, make sure that this website that this website is what it is claimed to be. And then once they've gone through their verification process and done all this work for us, they cryptographically sign the certificate using their private key. Aha. That is how we know that this certificate is valid. So they collect that information, they verify it, and they will append their digital signature. So let's see what our web browser actually does to check the certificate. Number one, it checks the integrity of the certificate. It will verify that the information in this certificate is correct. So if you scroll down, you can do this right now because I'm sure we are using SSL and TLS as we speak. My words are being encrypted as they're being sent to you. You can take a look at the lock icon, look at that certificate, and you will see a signature in there. This is a signature created using DigiCert's private key. Now you might be thinking to yourself, but wait, I need DigiCert's public key in order to verify this. Good news, you have it. In fact, your web browser is preloaded with the root certificate authority's public keys for many different certificate authorities. So you don't know it. It's like Dorothy in the Wizard of Oz. You click your heels and you actually have all of those root certificate public keys on your computer already. And your web browser does this behind the scenes automatically without you having to think about it. All you have to do is look at that lock icon and it will tell you if a certificate is not valid. But what's happening behind the scenes is that it's using the public certificate that came distributed with your computer to verify that the information in this is correct. The next thing it does is your web browser will make sure that the certificate has not expired. And these are designed to expire because if somebody steals a private key, for example, you don't want that out there forever. Also, the information about websites changes over time as well. So again, certificates are typically designed to expire after a period of time. And then the third thing that your web browser does is check the revocation status. Has somebody revoked their signature? So they make sure that the certificate has not been revoked. So if something gets stolen or if security is breached, they can put a certificate on a public revocation list and your web browser will alert you to that. All right, so that's the authentication and integrity piece. We've verified the owner, we've checked to make sure that the information, that certificate is valid. How do we keep information confidential as it goes across the web? How do we make sure nobody can hear my voice as I'm talking to you, except people who have registered for this meeting? One way we do that is, again, with SSL/TLS. TLS is Transport Layer Security. SSL is actually the older version. And we do this using symmetric and asymmetric key encryption. Remember, symmetric key encryption is faster. It is less resource intensive. And so when you are exchanging large volumes of data over the web, it is encrypted using symmetric key encryption. Your computer and the web browser share a secret key, and one of them locks it up and the other one will unlock it. In fact, what happens when you visit a secure website is that your computer will actually generate a a secret symmetric key for each session. A session is just a conversation that your computer is having. So your computer generates one for all the information being sent out, and the server will actually generate a second one for all information being sent back to you. And you will both have those secret keys and be able to decrypt the information for each session. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, but how do they have the same secret key? How do the server and the client, my computer, know that same secret and nobody else knows? We'll get to that in just a second. I also want to mention there's actually 2 more session keys that are created, and those are for digital signing to make sure that the information hasn't been modified. So we have a session key for confidentiality, we have another session key for digital signing, and we have them in both directions. So you end up with a total of 4 session keys created, and those change over time. All right, so how does your web browser and the server end up with the same secret key, but nobody else has it? That is the beauty of asymmetric key encryption. That's where it comes in. So remember, the server can present us with their public key when we do a handshake, when we're first introduced to each other. There's this initial handshake that the web browser and the web server and your browser do. The web server will give you a copy of its private key, and then your web browser will generate a secret and send it off to the server. And then they derive their session keys based on that shared secret. So asymmetric key is used to exchange that information the first time, to exchange that symmetric session key. And then because symmetric key encryption is faster, it is used to actually encrypt the bulk of your data. Make sense? Good. Again, I'll be around for questions afterwards, so feel free to drop them into the chat and we'll discuss a little bit more. All right, so that was a fairly simplified version, but that is the concept. Asymmetric key encryption is used to exchange that shared secret, which is used to derive session keys. Those session keys, there's one in each direction. They encrypt your traffic, and they will change over time. Now, encryption in transit is unfortunately not enough, because what happens when your data sits on the server at the other end, right? What happens if hackers break into the server? This happens all the time. One of the latest cases from this week was Kroger and Bombardier. I can never pronounce that. So Kroger said that pharmacy customer data was hacked because hackers broke into a file sharing service that they use. Same thing with Bombardier. It was the same third-party software vendor that was hacked into. And unfortunately, these files were not encrypted at rest when they were sitting on the server, and the attackers just stole that data and made off with it. So we have to make sure that we look beyond encryption in transit. When somebody tells you that your email is encrypted, you have to find out what that means. Are they talking about encrypted as it goes over the web? Are they talking about encrypted when it's sitting on a computer? We have seen a huge rash of business email compromise cases because criminals are stealing passwords and they're breaking into your account while that email is just sitting on the server. And in fact, in a lot of cases, the email actually is encrypted at rest. Let's talk about that. In Microsoft, all the files on OneDrive, all the files in SharePoint are encrypted with very strong encryption, AES 256-bit encryption using BitLocker. So if someone were to break into a Microsoft data center and take all those servers and throw them on a truck and take them away, they would not be able to access your data. Also, if a hacker just breaks into one of their servers, chances are they would not be able to access your data either because it is encrypted at rest. But think about the fact that when you log in, you can access your data. That means that the application must be decrypting it on the fly for you to access. So that begs the question of where are the keys stored? Who or what has access to the keys? If the application has access to the keys and can present them to you when you log in, that means that any attacker that steals your password can also break in and see that information. And that's where end-to-end encryption comes in. So end-to-end encryption means that even if somebody breaks into the cloud, they still can't get your data. End-to-end encryption means that the user that actually reads the message is the only one that has the private key. You can also do this in a way where it's managed by an enterprise. So maybe I have a private key and also there's a central IT team that has a private key. So there are some ways to make sure that we have some enterprise level capabilities as well, just so you guys are aware. But a good example of this is Signal. Signal is, of course, super popular now that Elon Musk has mentioned it. And Signal allows for end-to-end encryption where the keys are actually stored on your phone. And that means you have to be a party to the communications in order to decrypt the traffic. Now, the downside of this is you must keep track of your keys. If you lose your keys, your data is gone. So if you don't use Signal, try installing it and then see what happens if you lose your keys. I've actually, if you switch phones, for example, depending on if you don't manage to copy over your keys, you can have a problem accessing your data, things like that. So anyway, the bottom line is that end-to-end encryption, E2EE, means that the end user controls the private keys. Very powerful concept. There was a scandal last year involving Zoom. Zoom had been saying that they use end-to-end encryption. They actually had that right there in the Zoom meeting. But unfortunately, end-to-end encryption did not mean what they thought it meant. In fact, they appeared to be using a completely different definition than anybody else in the world because they weren't using end-to-end encryption. There was no private key in the end user's system. It was just using normal encryption in transit. And that meant that if someone got access to a Zoom server, they could potentially intercept those communications. Good news. After almost a year and a Federal Trade Commission settlement, in part for false advertising, Zoom just rolled out actual end-to-end encryption. And this is a huge leap forward. In fact, I believe they are the first major video conference provider that has end-to-end encryption as a capability. So really powerful stuff. If you have a meeting that you absolutely want to be completely confidential, this is a great option. It uses public key cryptography, so you hold the keys. You have to use the Zoom software because if you make a phone call, your phone is not managing private keys. So it's all done on the software side of things. There are also some other limitations. Not all the normal features work, but the video conference part of it does. So if you're interested, try it out. It has to be enabled by your administrator, and you need to look for that lock icon with the shield in it to indicate that end-to-end encryption really is turned on. So really excited about this. Again, this is a huge step forward in the deployment of this new technology. So we've seen end-to-end encryption widely deployed for phone conversations using Signal, for video conference now using Zoom. Where we don't have it is with email. And I think that's really interesting because we are certainly technically capable of having end-to-end encrypted email. Imagine like for healthcare, for example, if you want to share files with a third party, you can make sure that that is fully encrypted from beginning to end using public key encryption, but it was never really rolled out widely. And there's a few reasons for this. First of all, because it interferes with email monitoring. So back in the day when email providers did extensive mining on our emails, it would prevent them from doing that. And that means that they can't monetize access to your email for advertising or marketing purposes. So that's huge. Also, the government can't monitor emails if they're using end-to-end encryption. And so we saw huge pushback from government agencies that wanted to be able to monitor communications and couldn't if end-to-end encryption was employed. So those are two of the main reasons why end-to-end encryption was never even really widely supported. It is a fairly simple and straightforward technology. You can see that it was built in, or asymmetric key encryption anyway, was built into web surfing. We are totally capable of distributing public keys, but this was never done with email. If we're interfering with email monitoring, then that would make it difficult to do data loss prevention, DLP, or scanning for purposes of antivirus. Again, there are ways around that. Your enterprise can gain access to those emails in more complex ways, but it's not just straight out of the box. So end-to-end encryption has enormous potential for security. If you are encrypting your email end-to-end, that means that you're thwarting business email compromise. Imagine a world where if an attacker got your password and they logged into your email, they would see nothing. At LMG, we have used end-to-end encryption on our webmail from day one. And if an attacker breaks in, let's say Madison on our team sent me an email. If an attacker broke into my email, they would see this. That's it. So it really adds a huge extra layer of protection. And it's also pretty easy to use. Again, at LMG, we use it for all of our internal communications and some of our external communications. And it's fully automated within the system. So if I want to send Madison an email, automatically it will encrypt it, and I can see that by looking at the padlock icon. If the padlock is not closed, then I know it's not encrypted, but it usually is by default. What's happening on the back end is that my computer, as I type in her name, will automatically encrypt that message using Madison's public key. And I have her public key preloaded on my computer. I didn't have to do anything. That's how our computers are configured. And you can actually load anybody's public key by having your computer fetch it from a public key server. That's the whole point. You can load your public keys on a public key server and publish it. And also, this is what the key looks like. So you can see right there, it's her public key. It has some information about her, when it was created, all that stuff. Here's what it looks like on her end when she reads an encrypted email that I've sent to her. So I used her public key to encrypt it. Her email software automatically uses her private key to decrypt it and prompts her for her passphrase. You don't have to use passphrases, we did. And it can cache that passphrase or for a certain amount of time so that future emails can be read without her typing it in all the time. Okay, so all she has to do is type in her password to unlock the message, and boom, she can see my message and she can see that it was encrypted. So really straightforward and easy to use. Again, you may have heard people talk about encrypted emails and they're actually talking about a web portal. So your email goes to a web portal and then people use the word fluffy or whatever silly password they've sent to gain access to it. That type of, quote, secure email really isn't that secure. It means you're using a web page and it's all relying on whatever password the user happens to pick. Real encrypted email using end-to-end encryption is sent to your inbox. You have a public key and a private key that you use to lock and unlock messages. Everybody has a public key. It has your public key and they can use it to lock up messages to you. Only you have your private key. It's usually a file on your computer, and you can use that to unlock messages. So to get to our last bit, you can use this same technology, asymmetric key encryption, to verify who sent an email. Now imagine this world where you get a phishing email, or you get an email that looks like it comes from the CEO, but you can tell for sure if the CEO sent it or not. So here's an example. An executive says, "Are you busy? I need you to process a wire transfer for me today. Think of how much money people are losing." There's an email that looks like it comes from IT saying, "Do you want to keep your current password?" People fall for this. You have to be checking for spelling errors and stuff like that. Here's another one. Hey, it's a vendor we work with all the time. They've sent us an invoice and they've changed where the payment should get routed, so I need to update my records. How do I know that this really came from the vendor? Again, you shouldn't have to rely on spelling errors or hovering your mouse over links or things like that to figure out that it's a phishing email. There are ways that the CEO can cryptographically sign messages so you know for sure if it actually came from the CEO or not. And we have not been effectively using this technology. If you're wondering and thinking to yourself, why have we not used this technology? I wonder the same thing, because there's so much potential for it to dramatically reduce phishing attacks and prevent things like business email compromise. So hopefully over the next few years, we will see use of this ramp up. Here's an example of a digitally signed message at LMG. Everybody on our team knows that if I send a message asking them to do something, they need to check the digital signature. And if the digital signature is not valid, it did not come from me. So cryptographic signing can be very, very powerful. If you click into that little checkbox, you can see the information about my key, and it says this signature can be trusted. Again, my computer is doing that using automatically on the back end using keys that have been pre-installed. There's some tools that you can use to do this. SMIME is very popular. It works with Outlook. You can also use PGP and GPG. That's what we use. And this is the future. Again, we have not been leveraging this technology and taking full advantage of it. But my hope is that over the next few years, we can stop using those silly web portals, or at least move away from that, and instead use actual end-to-end encryption technology and digitally signed emails, because they can be much more efficient. All right, so some takeaways for today. I hope we understand that encryption has enormous potential, and we have not taken full advantage of that. So use encryption and really follow the latest news on technologies that are being deployed. Keep your keys and passwords safe. That is the #1 way that we can help protect ourselves when it comes to encryption. Make it hard for criminals to steal your private keys. If they are stolen, make sure you change them right away. And then back up your keys as well. Don't lose access to $220 million. Also, pay attention to warnings. If your web browser pops up and says, hey, you shouldn't trust this website, or this certificate has expired, pay attention to that, because there's a really good reason why that's happening. And finally, use strong algorithms. Most reputable sites are using strong algorithms, but never hurts to check. You can always Google that or talk to a security expert. I do want to mention that we have an upcoming Cyber First Responder class on March 10th. I'm going to be teaching that with Matt Duran. Really excited about it. It is 1 day, very intense. We're going to do hands-on incident response practice. So we have 3 hands-on labs: hard drive imaging, volatile evidence, network-based evidence collection, including collection from the cloud. And we will learn how to respond to cloud incidents, ransomware incidents, on-site malware infections, you name it. So make sure that you know the signs of a cybersecurity incident and you know what to do in those first few critical hours. Regular registration ends in 1 week. It is a 1-day class. And with that, we'll spend a few minutes here taking questions. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Sherry, so much for that. We do have a couple questions, and I wanted to remind the attendees that if you have any other questions, please use the QA tab in the chat function. So the first question we have is, how does learning about encryption help everyday users?
That's a great question. So when you understand how encryption works, you can take steps to protect yourself, more effective steps. So for example, now we know why private keys are so important. And you know what it means when the web browsers have those warnings. And you know why we want to back up our private keys so we don't lose access to things. Also, I'm hoping that it will make you feel more comfortable with using encryption technology in general, and that you understand the power of it so that we can all push for adoption of these more advanced capabilities.
Yes, thank you for explaining that. Another question is Gmail encrypted when sending from one Gmail address to another Gmail address? And to follow that, is Gmail confidential mode truly confidential?
Ooh, I would actually have to research the answer to those questions. So drop me a line on LinkedIn and we can kind of talk through it together. Typically, if you're sending from one address to another address within an email hosting provider, most modern hosting providers are using encryption internally these days, especially the big ones like Google and Microsoft, because they've really been through the ringer. They are targeted by attackers. So my guess would be that it is encrypted as it is in transit from one Gmail address to another, but I would have to research it to give you a definitive answer. I also want to go back to the previous question because I do know that many of the folks on this webinar today are in positions where you can either make decisions about how technology is implemented or you can influence those decisions. Maybe you're doing that for your organization or advising others. So I think that's a really important outcome, I hope, of this, where you can help to advise those you work with on how and why and when to adopt encryption.
Thank you for that. I love the questions that are coming in. One here is about best practices. So within an organization, is it best to encrypt all messages, or should we not bother when sending non-secret messages? For example, sending a meme to a coworker.
Yeah, and so encryption, of course, means different things. When you're talking about encrypting things in transit, it's really easy to set that up on the server level automatically so that users never have to think about it. So I would make sure you're always using SSL and TLS for all messages and all kinds of messaging systems, whether you're using email or Slack or whatever it is. I would just make sure that you're using that encryption in transit always. If you're asking whether or not to use end-to-end encryption on messages, again, it makes sense just to set it up so that it's always used. At LMG, all internal messages are always encrypted, and that way the user doesn't have to do anything. That's my goal. If users have to take a certain action, then you're going to have mistakes. I'm sure you guys have seen situations where you have to put secure in the subject line, for example, in order for a message to be encrypted. And we know what's going to happen. Users are going to spell secure wrong, or they're going to forget to put it there. So if you want to make sure that important messages are encrypted, it's best to just encrypt everything by default so the user has to do nothing.
Yeah, that's very simple. It's a good suggestion. The last question we have here is, how difficult is end-to-end encryption for Office 365, and how easy is it for non-techie people to adopt?
Yeah, again, another great question. It depends on how your IT administrator has set it up. When it's set up, when you put the time into tuning the system, it can be very seamless, and it depends if you're using Outlook or the web version of Office 365. To my knowledge, there was quite a bit of work a few years ago on plugins for Office 365 on the web, but I'm not sure where that is. Again, I'd have to check that out. To the best of my knowledge, there's not a great web plugin for that, and that's a really big limitation. I really hope to see Microsoft supporting end-to-end encryption for webmail a lot more effectively. I do know that they support SMIME using Outlook on your local system, and that's something that some of my clients have been transitioning to, which is a really exciting development. So again, drop me a line on LinkedIn. Happy to answer some more questions, and stay tuned to check out our blog and our YouTube channel for more developments in the future.
Great. Thank you so much, Sherry. Once again, I'm Natalie Adams with LMG Security. We would like to thank everyone who attended today's webinar. Please take a moment to fill out the survey afterwards and let us know what you thought of today's presentation. The recorded video and any handouts will be made available to attendees, and we will send out a notification once they are live. Thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of your day.